I hereby open this academic ceremony in which Shaiv Parikh will defend the academic thesis investigating the biological and physical complexities of ascending thoracic aortic aneurysms. May I invite you to present a summary of your studies and the conclusion of your thesis?
Yes. Thank you. Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Corona, dear supervision team, colleagues, friends, and family, first of all, I would like to thank you all for coming to my defense. In the next few minutes, I'll be taking you through the content of my thesis titled Investigating the Biological and Physical Complexities of Ascending Thoracic Aortic Aneurysms. So the ascending aorta is the largest artery which is connected directly to the heart. It serves as a major pipeline to the distributary pipelines that supply blood to the body. Sometimes there are local dilatations that appear on the aorta, and if they occur on the top part, which is the ascending part, these are termed as the ascending thoracic aortic aneurysms. Now, this condition has a tendency to progress and eventually create rupture or dissection of the tissue. Now, to prevent this from happening, surgical intervention is necessary, which entails removing the aneurysmatic part and replacing it by a graft. Now, the decision for surgical intervention is based on diameter measurements acquired from medical images such as MRI or CT scans. The reason for looking at diameter measurements from medical images is that, first of all, they are non-invasive in nature, and secondly, they are relatively easier to obtain. Despite the guidelines, it was observed in a large number of patients that dissections still occurred without meeting the intervention guidelines. So the question over here to ask is that, is diameter measurement a sufficient metric to decide the clinical guidelines for intervention? So to answer that question, we explored non-diameter metrics in this thesis, for which we took a biomechanical perspective. So we basically relied on three fundamental pillars of biomechanics, which is geometry, kinematics, and constitutive modeling. And the meaning of each will get clearer in the upcoming slides. So the general assumption for aneurysm formation is that aneurysms, they exhibit outward hypertrophic remodeling, which means that as the diameter increases, there is a decrease in thickness of the wall during aneurysm formation. So to verify this fact, we performed a literature survey where we looked into 15 studies, and the outcome of those studies was that there was no particular correlation between the wall thickness and the aortic diameter. There was also no consensus amongst different measurement techniques that were used across all the studies. So we also concluded from this study that probably the aortic tissue exhibits an active process wherein, as the diameter increases, it is not necessary that the wall thickness decreases and the tissue tries to maintain the wall thickness. So next, we move to kinematics, where we basically look at the motion of objects. So we know that the heart is a beating organ. It pumps blood to the body. And as the heart pumps blood, the first part that the blood enters is the ascending aorta. And as the blood enters the ascending aorta, it also starts beating. So the question here is that how do we measure these aortic deformations? So for that, we came up with an intraoperative strain measurement technique where in patients undergoing open chest surgeries, we place markers on top of the aorta and then we track them over time to measure how the aorta is deforming. So a pair of markers was placed near the heart on the aorta, and another pair of markers was placed away from the heart, thereby dividing the aorta into 4 segments. So after this, we tracked the markers using an in-house developed video tracking algorithm. And as a result, what we obtained was the time variation of the distance between the markers. So after that, we analyzed, we obtained our strains So basically, the strains are, we calculated strains as relative deformations. So what that means is that it's the distance between the markers, the change in the distance between the markers while going from the lowest point on the wave to the highest point on the wave. So once these strain estimates were performed, we looked at the strain patterns on the total included patient cohort, where we saw that the strains near the heart were greater than the strains away from the heart, while there were no significant differences observed between the left and the right region on the aorta. So we also next looked into, we separated the patient cohort into two different cohorts. One cohort was comprising of non-aneurysmatic patients, and the other was aneurysmatic patients. And what we observed was that both these cohorts retained the same strain pattern that we observed on the total patient cohort. But interestingly, the non-aneurysmatic patients had higher strains as compared to the aneurysmatic patients. So now one might wonder, why do we observe these strain patterns? So is there any underlying process which is happening in the tissue, and the strains are manifestations of that? So to answer that, we must move to the next part, which is constitutive modeling. And as you can see on the screen, that if we have a normal aorta, and it has been found, we know that as the aorta progresses from a normal condition to an aneurysmatic condition, there are microstructural changes taking place in the tissue. So in these green images, you can see the microstructure of the tissue. So the one which is next to the aorta, normal aorta, you can see the fibers are quite well defined, while the one, the green image which is next to the aneurysmatic aorta has distorted fiber structure with breaks in it. So now what does this mean in terms of constitutive modeling? So when we are talking about constitutive modeling, we are thinking in terms of energy. So let's assume that we stretch these two pieces of tissues up to the same amount. As a consequence of that, we would see that these two pieces of tissues will store different amounts of energy. Now, if we are somehow able to quantify these differences in energy, we can say something about the material property of the tissue. However, the challenge over here is how do we perform this material parameter estimation in vivo? So I will walk through that process, but before that, I'll go through a physiological interlude. So what is physiologically happening in the body is that as the blood pressure rises, there is also an increase in diameter. Now, if we plot multiple of these points, we get a graph something like this. However, from medical images, what we usually get is two different blood pressures, and therefore two different geometries. So how does it actually work? If we want to simulate this situation, what shall we do? So basically, we need, to create this situation, we need a zero pressure configuration of the aorta wherein no pressure is acting. And we should know the material property of the tissue. Now, as we start pressurizing this zero pressure geometry, we start obtaining the information in terms of geometry that we observe from the medical images. However, the challenge still remains, and that is we do not know the zero pressure configuration and the material properties in vivo beforehand. So to find out these two entities, we developed a biomechanical characterization algorithm. So the way it works is as follows. So first we assume a zero pressure configuration and the material property of the aorta, and then we subsequently pressurize this zero pressure configuration to obtain the geometries at two different pressure conditions. Now we compare the simulated data with the medical image data, and if these two do not match, then we must go back to the first step and modify our zero pressure configuration and the material property. And then we again pressurize the zero pressure configuration to obtain two different geometries, and then we look at the equality between the simulated data and the medical image data. Once this equality is satisfied, we can say that we have found the material property and the zero pressure configuration. We tested this algorithm on synthetically generated data in the lab, and what we found is that our algorithm had an accuracy of greater than 98%. Therefore, we also deemed our algorithm to be suitable to be implemented on real patient data. However, so far there is an important consideration which I have not discussed, but the next step is related to that, and that is how the aorta deforms and the consideration of the aortic deformations in running the biomechanical characterization algorithm. So the general assumption for most of the arteries in the body is that they're fixed in length. And the only deformation which is observed is in the radial direction, which means only the diameter of the vessel is changing. However, from our intraoperative video measurements, we can see that it's not only the diameter which is changing over time, but it's also the length of the aorta which is changing over time. So the actual deformations that we observe are the biaxial deformations, which means the change in length, but also change in diameter. So now, if we consider these two assumptions and then run our biomechanical characterization algorithm, what we see is that the stored energy using the biaxial deformation is higher in the aortic tissue, but also the wall stresses are higher in the aortic tissue when we consider biaxial deformation. However, the most important fact that we found was that the accuracy in estimating the material properties is better with biaxial deformations, especially for the ascending aorta. So now if we go back to our slide and we think about the green images of tissue microstructure, we were basically looking at differences in energy. And with this better accuracy of estimating the material properties, we can distinguish the tissue properties better. So in conclusion, in this thesis, what we observed was that aneurysms do not always exhibit outward hypertrophic remodeling, which means there is necessarily not an increase in diameter and decrease in wall thickness. But at the same time, as a field, we need to develop a gold standard for measuring the aortic geometry, which entails diameter and wall thickness measurements. Next, we were able to come up with a novel strain measurement technique through which now we can measure local aortic strains. However, these strains are manifestations of underlying tissue properties. So we must combine these strain measurements with in-depth tissue studies, where we also look at the microstructure of the tissue. In the end, we were able to develop the biomechanical characterization algorithm, which can be now implemented on patient data, and then we can know a little bit more about the material property estimation in vivo. However, while doing that, we must not forget to include these biaxial deformations, otherwise our understanding of the biomechanical properties of the aorta is incomplete. So with this, I'd like to end the presentation, and I hand the word back to the prorector.
Thank you, dear candidate, for your very clear and educational lecture. And we will now proceed to the opposition. This is where it all begins. Yes. And the opposition will be opened by Professor Coy. She is a professor of medical physics at this university. And she's also the chair of the assessment committee of your thesis. Professor Coy.
Thank you, Prorector, dear candidate. First, I would like to congratulate you with your beautiful thesis, and I would also like to congratulate your promotion team. And yes, the topic of your thesis, I found it really interesting. My first question is about Proposition 2. So I would like to ask one of your paralymps to read Proposition 2.
Accurately estimating aortic wall thickness is a significant challenge in both in vivo and ex vivo settings.
Right, thank you. So this really puzzled me, and I also noticed that in Chapter 2 you report the lumen to vessel wall ratio, but you do not actually report the vessel wall thickness itself. So I was really puzzled, because I can imagine in vivo it's really challenging to measure the vessel wall because it's very thin, and also because of the cardiac and respiratory motion. But why is it so hard ex vivo?
highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question and the compliments. What we basically did in the second chapter is that we collected aortic rings from patients, and we took the sample immediately in the surgery, and we had a makeshift platform with a camera mounted on the platform, and we took the images there. However, the main challenge over there was, first of all, to align the imaging plane of the camera, the plane where the tissue sample was placed and the plane of the camera. So they should be exactly parallel without any precision tools inside the OR setting. That was a challenge to align them. Secondly, the aortic tissue that we got and the rings that we excised from that, they tended to have inner projections. So if we can imagine a cylinder, and what we would expect normally is that we only see the top part with the wall thickness in the image. But what we were also observing was the projection of the cylindrical wall, which is along the length direction inside the imaging plane. So the main challenge over there was to distinguish the real wall thickness from the projections that we were obtaining. So therefore, we found that it was a little bit challenging to get those wall thicknesses.
Okay, right. Well, so thank you for clarifying that. My next question is about chapter 4. You observed that the proximal strains were actually higher than the distal strains using this intraoperative technique. But of course, it would be really wonderful if you could also measure this non-invasively. So do you think this could also be measured with non-invasive imaging, for example?
I've thought about this question a lot, and we have also attempted to measure these strains non-invasively. And that would be the dream, I would say, for clinicians as well as for biomechanical engineers to quantify those strains. However, the main challenge for non-invasive strain measurements, especially on the ascending aorta, is that there are no anatomical markers which are very localized. Therefore, we had to resort to placing the markers on top of the aorta and then measure and see how the markers were deforming. So such anatomical hinge points are not present. Therefore, we can measure global strains, so going from the aortic root to the brachiocephalic trunk, but that covers quite a global region. However, as we want to go local, there's nothing to see in the images that we can follow over time.
Yeah, and what about feature tracking or speckle tracking?
Yes, so with speckle tracking, speckle tracking is the... Okay, yeah, I got confused with the MRI tagging, but speckle tracking does not provide a full range, or we are not able to select the region that we want to select because of the probe. It's an echo measurement, so it already provides a limited field of vision.
Yeah, and what about feature tracking if you would use 3D cine MRI data?
Again, I think if we have the MRI data and we want to, if we have two different geometries, one at diastolic pressure and the other at systolic pressure, we can still look at the whole deformation. And in terms of features, I would understand something that we recognize in the image. So what we can recognize would be the aortic root, where we can clearly see the valves, and somewhere at the top where the bifurcation starts, and then there is a change in geometry. However, on the ascending aorta, it is quite difficult to spot any feature that can be tracked, because the goal of the algorithm is to follow one particular point over time.
Yeah, but are you aware, like with feature tracking using cine MRI data, because then you also do not have a real anatomical landmark?
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that.
Oh, okay. But yeah, you can also use like signal intensity and homogeneities in your MR images to try to quantify the strain.
Okay, yeah. This is something then we should look into.
Okay, and then one final question, if I may. Also in chapter 4, you report that the patients undergoing aortic repair, that they have actually lower strains than the other patient groups. But I was just wondering, is this not just due to the larger aortic diameter in the patients with which are scheduled for aortic repair?
The reason I would say that the diameter would not be an influence in this case because what we are looking at is strains. So it's a relative deformation. So we already considered, we are normalizing with respect to the diameter. Since strain measurements are dimensionless, we already took into consideration, we corrected for at which geometry we are looking at.
But I think you also showed that the strain was actually positively correlated, I think, with the diameter. So that seems to be in contradiction to me.
Indeed. The thinking over there to correlate with the diameter is that indeed the strain measurements are independent of the geometry in itself. That is by definition of strain. However, we looked at diameter measurements and looked at strains is because we are probably we are under the assumption, or we are hypothesizing that the microstructure is changing. So if we look at a dimensionless quantity there, and then we look at diameter, maybe the diameter is exhibiting the change in structure, microstructure of the tissue. So with that change, probably the strains are, the tissue is getting stiffer, and the strains are getting lower. So that was the assumption that that we had.
Yeah, I think I find this really intriguing, so I would like to discuss with you for a long time, but for time's sake, I give the word back to the prorector. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kooi. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Gasser. He is professor of, let me see here, biomechanics of the Royal Institute of Technology, the KTH in Stockholm, and he is also member of the assessment committee of your thesis. And Professor Gasser, the university is very grateful to you for traveling all the way here to Maastricht to take part in this ceremony here today. Professor Gasser.
Thank you. Thank you very much for handing over the word to me, Prorector. And dear candidate, congratulations to your very nice piece of work. And I very much enjoyed reading that. And it's a great, let's call it translation and effort that you present here in your thesis. Now my question is the following. So the very principle of defining deformation means that you have to refer to something, right? So the undeformed configuration or reference configuration. And in your presentation here, you introduced something what you call the pressure-free configuration or the load-free configuration. But we know that this load-free configuration is in general not stress-free and not undeformed because there is something in there which is broadly spoken residual strains or residual deformation. And my questions will all refer to this residual deformation, and they're going to break it down in some sub-questions. And the first question is, why do we have these residual strains, and where do they come from, and how do they develop?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question and your compliments. May I ask you to rephrase the question?
The question is, we do have residual deformation in unloaded vessel configurations, right? So in your pressure-free configuration, there are residual deformations in there, right?
Right.
And these are called residual deformations. And the question is, why are they in there, and where do they come from?
The reason for residual deformations, so I would like to answer this into two parts. So first is the actual configuration, which is zero pressure configuration. And in this thesis, and also with the algorithm, we did not consider the residual stresses which would be generated when the configuration goes from the actual stress-free state to the zero pressure configuration, because the vessel usually deforms even further when we cut it open. So, so that part was not considered in this algorithm, because usually to be able to do that, we need an assumption of the material properties. However, the algorithm over here addresses how to find the material properties. So that was a challenge, and we were also under the assumption that it could be a thin cylinder. So if the thickness is lower in the geometry, then the residual stresses while going from the stress-free state to the zero pressure configuration are of very low order. So that part was not considered. But if I now thinking about the question again, and where do these residual stresses come from? It is an effect of growth and remodeling. So as the tissue starts changing its extracellular matrix, new constituents are entered. They enter the aortic wall, and since this state is constantly evolving, if there is an aneurysm formation, then the residual stresses would be also evolving, because our in vivo homeostatic state, if that is what we may consider, is constantly evolving. So the zero pressure configuration should also evolve with the change in the geometry as well as the material properties.
Right. I think your answer is perfectly right, because the tissue or the blood vessel never sees the unloaded configuration, right? It grows in a completely different configuration. And this introduction of the load-free configuration or reference configuration is a completely hypothetical entity that engineers came up with in order to apply this concept of continuum biomechanics. Very good. So then the next question, as you said in your thesis on your work, you did not consider residual stresses, which is true. And the question is, what mistake or what error you?
So the first mistake that comes to my mind is that this algorithm was designed on isotropic material. So we are not considering any fibers, while in reality there are fibers in the tissue. So again, coming back to I can link that with the residual or the stress-free state, or the residual stresses in the vessel wall. So, and I've been thinking about this, that the fibers in the vessel wall, they are at a different stress state as compared to the ground matrix, which is the elastin. So if these two are at different residual stresses and residual stretches, then the stress that we will come up with in the end will be incorrect, even though the vessel is satisfying the mechanical equilibrium condition, because it is equilibrated with the pressure in the end. However, the stress state of the vessel will be different.
Very, very good. Yes, I think my time is running out. We could continue this discussion a very long time, because residual stresses are something that is very curious and very well, not very well explored. But you're completely right, it influences your results, and the more one thinks about that, the more error you introduce by not using them.
Yes.
Please.
Thank you, Professor Gasser. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Moroni. He's Professor of Biofabrication at this university and also member of the assessment committee of your thesis. Professor Moroni.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, I also would like to congratulate you with a very interesting piece of work and extend my congratulations to your supervisory team. It has been really nice for me to also go back in the journey of my engineering time in my undergraduate period. I had to indeed also remove some of the rust, I must admit, with all the questions that were contained in the book, but nonetheless it was a pleasure to do so. May I ask to start my question to actually, well, maybe the second paragraph, read proposition number 6.
Our understanding of the mechanobiological implications of non-homogeneous ascending aortic strains patterns will always remain incomplete.
Thank you. So with a short answer, otherwise we also spend all the time that I have available. Can you summarize for me what is incomplete and what actually you think should, or what actually will remain incomplete?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question and your compliments. What I came across in this study is that the first part, which is only looking at the strains, and then one must wonder that what are these strains manifestations of? So, do strains tell us the whole story? And I think that it is not complete till we start considering multiple other factors, which could be in terms of forces and energy, which are going into these deformations. Now, the first challenge, because I see multiple layers here coming into picture, so the first challenge itself is to measure the deformations, and that itself is very far from being accurate in vivo. And then the other challenge that comes into the picture is the synchronization of the pressure and how these deformations are taking place. So that is another challenge. And then as we keep moving forward, there is the vessel is comprising of multiple layers, which we are also not taking into account while looking at the strains. So if we keep adding up all these, so it comes down to the material properties of the constituents. And these constituents, it has been proven experimentally that they keep changing when there are strains, when they're subjected to multiple strain-varying strains. So to be able to do that, we need to take care of this whole spectrum.
Yeah. So let me dive a little bit into that spectrum. Now, you have talked about different layers. I can certainly imagine that from a circular perspective, you have also different layers of fibers, right? And you have mentioned also in your presentation that you have not taken into consideration fibers. But looking now at one of the major points you have done, which is looking at these axial strains, how do axial strains affect circular strains?
That's a very good question, and I've been working on that very recently. So, first thing that would happen over there is that if we can imagine, so we know that the arteries are incompressible in nature, and as a consequence of that, we can equate it to the deformation of how a block would deform. So if we can imagine a cube and we stretch it in one direction, the other dimension decreases. Mm-hmm. So a similar thing would also be happening with arteries. And with these biaxial deformations, that once the length is increasing, there should be a decrease in diameter.
Yeah. So if we now go back a little bit with the discussion you had with Professor Gosser, when removing the residual stress, what is the intrinsic limitation of doing that when then translating what you have done with the clinical real case scenario?
Yes. The residual stresses, and I see these where the field stands at the moment. I see these two things as different, and I would not put them together, because one entails the challenges of estimating the material properties, while the strains are, I view them as clinical metrics, which do not require the whole physics behind it. And therefore, it could be a new biomarker which can enhance our risk prediction capacity for aneurysm formation or dissection.
So for an early detection of possible aneurysm risks.
Indeed.
Okay, thank you. Let me then move to chapter 6, and then specifically the first figure at page 114. And there you have your two different models being equated. So if I, just simple question, if I look at this, how does it compare again to human tissue? Which one of the two would represent what happens in human tissue more closely?
Yes. So this figure 1 is basically, it's a result of a simulation.
Yeah.
And when we simulate the pressurization of the vessel while keeping the length fixed, and this is again coming back to the simulation domain only, then we get the curve which is solid. But what is actually happening in the human is indeed the one which is the dashed line.
Yeah, so shorter or smaller variations in the diameter would really have a much steeper effect on the pressure.
Indeed.
So do I have to conclude that the DVAS model would be better off than the FAS model?
Indeed.
Okay. Now, trying to also kind of make a bridge between the different studies that you have done. When how does the models, or maybe specifically the DVAS model, compensate for variations in well thickness that you have measured in chapter 2 and 3?
Yes. So DVAS model, again, if we are under the assumption that the vessel is incompressible, then the DVAS model would, on top of the pressurization of the vessel, it would decrease the wall thickness because the radial the stretches in the radial direction of the vessel would be dependent on how much it is changing the diameter, but also how much the length is being changed. So it will be inversely proportional. Change in the wall thickness would be inversely proportional to the change in diameter and change in the length. So if we start considering DVAS model, then we may end up with a lower wall thickness in vivo.
Which then again would confirm that the model would be more predictive for possible aneurysm incidents. Am I correct? By having a smaller thickness? I'm not sure if I'm correct. So the answer also that I'm not correct is also fine. It's a more dialogue that
I'm thinking about the meaning of the question. So if I understand it correctly, what you're suggesting is that if we go with the DVAS assumption, then it should be more important for aneurysm prediction. Yes, it should be more important for aneurysm prediction, and that also comes down to the challenges that we face with MRI techniques, because if we have two different images, then the wall thickness would have changed while going from the diastolic to the systolic state, given that how much the vessel is stretching in the actual direction.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I have one last question, if I may, Mr. Prorector.
Really short.
Yes, I'll make it short, and I'll ask you then also to be short. Now, this has been all in consideration of dilations or change in dimensions in relation to aneurysm, but would there be a possibility with these models to also add an extra layer of complexity, for example, calcified tissues?
Yes, that is also a very interesting topic. I would say that I'm not aware of how these models could be adapted to calcification analytically. So the 6th chapter is an analytical model. However, if we are looking into calcification, then we may want to define different regions with different stiffnesses. So then we come down to computational model, which is in the chapter 5.
Okay. So thank you so much. Yeah, that's indeed where I was also going with my line of thinking. It's nice to hear that you think along. Thank you. I give back the word to the prorector.
Thank you, Professor Moroni. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Van Brakel from the Department of Cardiothoracic Surgery of the Catharina Hospital in Eindhoven. And also to you, Dr. Rutten, our university is very thankful and impressed by your perseverance of reaching the location of this ceremony today, as our city council decided to close both tunnels, East and West Bank, and also a major access road. And this all, to top this all off, on a major German holiday. So thank you for your perseverance in being here, and the floor is yours, Dr. Van Brakel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dear candidate, dear team of your promotion team, congratulations for this great work. And as a cardiac surgeon, I read your work from a clinical perspective, and I will take my role in that, in this corona. And I was especially triggered by your chapter 6, where you discussed dynamic axial stretching of the aorta. And in clinical practice, we have, of course, aortic elongation as a measure besides size, also in the guideline. So a length of 11 centimeters could be an indication for surgery, but that's over a long time, of course. That's not axial stretching in a cardiac cycle. And you modeled this. And I combined this with a clinical observation that if you make an echocardiography from the heart in the long axis, you can see at the end of the cardiac cycle, at the end of the systolic phase, so beginning of diastole, you see closure of the valve, and then you see moving the aortic annulus into the heart because of the blood column that really smashes against the valve. And this gives, in the echo, it gives elongation. And I wondered if you know this water hammer effect.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question and your compliments. I'm actually not aware of the hammer effect, but what I can think of is that as the blood is released in the aorta, and depending on the closure or the opening of the valve, there could be some turbulence, and then the blood could be hitting the wall and then coming back. And thereby creating distortions in the aortic elongation. So that is something that I would think of.
Yeah, it's like also for the audience, if you turn off the tap very fast, you close a valve, and then the pipes, they give a smash. You can hear that in your kitchen. And this is also happening in the aorta, and I think that in the proximal part, where this is more effective than in the distal part of the ascending aorta, you have more elongation during the cycle, and it's also where we observe ruptures, or when you have a dissection, you see, especially at this place, you see dissection. And the question is, do you think you can model this? Because in your model, you don't count on this effect. But would it be possible to model different stretch areas in the ascending aorta?
Yes, so the answer to that question is yes. And then if we want to model that, we need to move beyond the topics covered in this thesis. So in order to address that kind of question, I would include a fluid structure interaction model. So not just looking at the solids, which we are looking at right now, but also how the fluid is exchanging its momentum with the wall. And when that happens, then we see different kinds of stretches taking place in the aorta, defined on how we collect the experimental data. So experimental data in this case would be the blood flow.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we can go on this topic, but I think I go to my next question because of time. And that is related to your chapter 1 and 2, where you looked at wall thickness and your wall to lumen ratio. And in the clinics, we have patients, particularly patients with bicuspid aortic valves, which is 2% of the population, where we see dilatation of the aorta in many of them. And we see differences in outer curvature and inner curvature thickness. We know that from clinical studies, not only in thickness, but also in media degeneration and pathophysiological mechanisms. But in your model, you don't look at differences in outer and inner curvature, but you have the data because you took out the tissue and you made a very nice drawing with outer curvature, inner curvature. So I wondered if you looked at this and if you observed this, did you see it in bicuspid or tricuspid valve patients? And if you saw it, why didn't you put it in the model?
So that's an excellent question. So the reason why we did not look into the differences in thicknesses, and it is indeed true that there would be a regional variation of the thickness. So the study is not capturing that effect. And the reason why it is not capturing that effect is that we wanted to look into the most basic used ratio, which is wall-to-lumen ratio. And even though there are variances in thicknesses across the vessel wall, while looking at these stresses, we still apply Laplace's law, which is proportional to the wall-to-lumen ratio, which also does not consider the variation in wall thickness. So if I'm looking at the variance in the wall thicknesses, then I would still use that data, but in a different setting and not looking at a clinically measurable Laplace's law.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm happy with your answers and would like to give back.
Thank you, Dr. Van Brakel. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Mees. He is Professor of Vascular Repair and Regeneration at this university. He's a member of the assessment committee of your thesis, and in addition, today he is secretary to the promotion committee. Professor Mees.
Thank you very much, Prorector. Dear candidate, thank you very much for inviting me to assess your thesis. It's lovely, and I love it, because it's about the aorta, and I love the aorta. I love to touch the aorta, but I really like even more to speak about the aorta and to treat the aorta, and in the future without touching it. I'd like to congratulate the team, all focusing on the aorta as well. In your second paragraph of the thesis, you describe something which not really puzzled me, but interested me. It is the aortic paradox. And the aortic paradox here is explained by you, saying that despite the reliance on diameter measurement to guide elective surgical intervention, more than half of so-called type A dissections occur at a diameter below the recommended threshold. The thesis is titled about thoracic aortic aneurysms. So my first puzzle or paradox is, so what is the thesis about? Aortic dissections or aortic aneurysms?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and the question. So basically, this thesis is about aneurysms. And since dissections are a complication which could be brought in by aneurysms, it was mentioned in the thesis.
Okay, because every time you describe the relevance of your work, you fall back to dissections. Because I think in the guidelines it's very well known that there is a clear risk diameter correlation. So for rupture in an aneurysm, the larger the diameter of the aneurysm, the higher the risk of rupture. And there's a huge amount of data on when the risk of rupture is 1%, at which diameter the risk of rupture is 3%. So therefore, I'm puzzled if you are investigating a new system to correlate the risk of rupture to something else than diameter, or that you're working on predicting dissections, because dissections are maybe not so much related to diameter.
Yes, so the way I view dissections and rupture is in terms of material failure. So the material is failing, and therefore either of the events could happen. And the goal of this thesis was also to delve into how we look at the material behavior. So once we understand how the material is behaving in vivo, that would automatically translate to if you're looking at dissections or ruptures.
So let's continue on that material then. Again, with this paradox of dissections versus rupture, what is the difference between the two? For the wall, what happens?
So rupture I view it as a complete breakage of the wall, while dissection is the delamination of the, starting from the intimal tear and then progressing.
Okay. And why does the dissection happen in lower diameters or maybe in other aortas? What is the difference between the material properties or the causes, you think?
So when I think of dissection, what comes to my mind is how the tissue is failing materially. So one is due to the shearing, which is the delamination, and the reason why dissections would be occurring at lower diameters, and we now think in terms of how the blood flow would be affected when the diameter is larger and the diameter is lower. So as the diameter is increasing, the blood velocity decreases with a higher diameter, while the pressure is increasing. So there, the pressure might cause the rupture of the tissue because it is completely failing there. While with lower diameters, the velocity is increasing. It has an increased velocity. So with also higher velocity, there might be higher wall shear stresses. So
is this relevant in ascending aortic aortas of 3 to 4 centimeter in width? So big. Is there really a difference in velocities?
I cannot. I do not have a number at the top of my.
I mean, we do see a huge difference in velocities in tight stenosis, for example. So this is a vessel of a centimeter wide that turns into a millimeter wide. Then you see really velocity difference. But is there a real velocity difference between a 4 and a 5 centimeter ascending aorta?
I cannot think
I don't know.
of an answer for that.
I'd like to learn a bit more from your knowledge. I'm often working in the abdominal aorta, which is actually incidence-wise there's many more patients with abdominal aortic problems than the ascending aortic problems. But we never see dissections in these, even not when they are dilated or when they are smaller diameter. And we also see a clear difference in growth rate. For example, ascending aortic aneurysms are often slowly growing, while the abdominal aortic aneurysms are having a growth rate of 2 to 3 times as large. Can you teach me some thing about the abdominal aorta, or how I should look at your work in that?
Yeah. So we again go from the dissection arguments, why they can occur in the ascending aorta and not in the abdominal aorta. I would attribute that to the geometrical differences. So the ascending aorta has a curvature, and because of the curvature, the flow is also not going to have a smooth laminar flow, while in the abdominal aorta, it is relatively straight, has a relatively straight geometry. So there, I would expect lesser distortions in the fluid velocity, and therefore also the wall shear stresses. And I think the effect of pressure would be predominant in the abdominal aorta, and therefore a higher propensity for rupture rather than dissection.
I think time's up, so I would like to give the word back to the prorector. I thank you for your answers. I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mees. The opposition will now be concluded by Dr. Rutten from the Department of Cardiovascular Biomechanics of the Eindhoven University of Technology. Thank you for being here, Dr. Rutten.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, I would like to congratulate you on the publication of your thesis. It's a nice set of work. And I would also like to include your promotion team into my congratulations. They did a good job, I guess. It's about the mechanics of ATAs, and with a bit of patient data and quite a lot of numerical modeling. And in my view, the trouble with this kind of research, and especially when you use patient data, is always twofold. How good are your images that you use for actually getting the motion that you want to measure in terms of spatial resolution maybe, and also timing? That's one thing. And with respect to the aortic pressure, because you have to have everything in one shot, synchronized, that's one thing. And the second, of course, is the mechanical properties of the material. You have to choose a model that actually describes what's going on inside the material. So there's probably a trade-off in accuracy here, between either, on one side, the accuracy of the measuring methods to actually get the motion of the tissue, and to connect that with the pressure that you want to impose maybe on your calculations. And on the other hand, the model. How good is your model? in your how are these things called in English? In your statements, you also talk about the boundary conditions. When we look at these three factors, which one of you think is the one to get absolutely right? And which one can you play around with a little bit in terms of getting your model to produce something that's useful?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question and the compliment. So to answer your question, I think the model is as good as the data that we acquire. So modeling point of view, of course, there are the problems with the residual stresses and complex material properties, but I would place more emphasis on collection of the boundary conditions. And also related to the images, the resolution of the images was ranging, if I remember correctly, it was ranging from 0.5 mm to 1 mm for MRI images. Yeah. But if I still stick to the precision of collecting the measurements, that would not be a problem in terms of distinguishing between different conditions. So considering that precision is maintained, accuracy will not be obtained in terms of acquiring geometry, but the most important part is the boundary conditions. And with boundary conditions, we struggle because the pressure which we acquired and implemented on the model, it has been obtained from brachial arteries. So that is not exactly the pressure which is acting in the aorta. So there is that is a limitation, but also a gap that can be filled in by, let's say, an FSI simulation or a fluid structure interaction simulation, where we can model the blood flow and obtain the pressure fields. So again, to obtain the input for FSI models, we go back to the boundary conditions, which is the flow in the aorta. Okay. Also, the movement of the aorta, the aortic root, is quite important, because then it significantly affects the biomechanical properties. So therefore, I see that in addition to the geometry, the boundary conditions are quite important.
Okay, thank you. I think I agree with that, especially the material properties. You can't really say something about the material properties in very much detail. So as maybe a simple model will also do, and you can suffice with getting the geometry and the boundary conditions right. Thank you. Then there is another thing. There's, in my view, there's one quite big issue, well, missing in your thesis. You didn't touch upon it. But in many papers that deal with this subject also don't touch upon it, and we already heard it from Professor Mays, for instance. It's about the rupture behavior of the material. At the end of the day, you want to address the rupture risk of an aneurysm, and there's not a lot you can do if you just don't know what the rupture behavior of the material is. So if you had a lot more time, how would you go about including rupture risk assessment into the models that you have devised for this thesis work?
Yeah. So the way I view rupture is, again, as we discussed previously, it's a failure of the material. Yep. Now, in vivo, that is not possible, because then we need to stretch the tissue till the failure point. And when it ruptures, we can measure that, but that is only in the ex vivo setting. Yep. So as a next step, what I would do in order to include the rupture risk is that collect the tissues, stretch them, find the rupture point of the tissue in ex vivo setting, and then go back to the parameters that we find from our measurements. Because in this thesis, we also were attempting to go as much as possible into in vivo or semi-in vivo setting. Mm-hmm. But in vivo or semi-in vivo, it is not possible to measure the rupture potential. So we are highly reliant on ex vivo experiments to determine that.
Okay, agreed. When you want to implement this rupture risk, can you then suffice with the type of modeling that you have done for the material properties so far, being a completely homogeneous wall behavior across the whole section of the aortic piece of aortic tissue that you're looking at? Or how much do you think you will need to have a look at the localization of your material properties? Would that be of importance?
yes, that would be of extreme importance. So this model will not capture the rupture potential, despite, given that we have the data. So what this model should be having is differences in material properties across different segments of the aorta, and that is the information that we are having in a different study from the same.
Dear candidate, the time allotted for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee shall now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. And I request you and your company to await the results of our deliberations and our return here in this room. Jij moet met mij mee hier nu, hè?
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. The line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you grow. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Dear candidate, dear Shaiv Parikh, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and take into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Delhaas is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Please all rise.
Dear Mr. Parikh, before I can confer the doctor title on you, you have to promise the following thing. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
Then, by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Shaiv Amit Parikh, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Dear Dr. Parikh, the laudatio will now be spoken by your first supervisor.
Yeah, so it's indeed Dr. Parikh. Congrats. Also on behalf of the other members of your supervisory team, Koen Racing from right to left, or from left to right for the audience, Koen Racing, Elham Bidar and Wouter Hubers, but they changed the position. We are immensely proud of you. You did it. You earned your PhD, crossing that final academic threshold with flying colors. And given your position, I was also pleased with the layman talk that you managed indeed to get that difficult stuff towards the audience. But could you have imagined standing here today as a young doctor, confidently defending your work and finding and fielding questions from experts, perhaps in the past 4 to 5 years, but the journey that brought you here was anything but predictable. And yet, despite its twists and turns, it was defined by your persistence and theoretical personality, but also, if I may so, by some question marks. And one of them is your birthplace. Is this Vadodara, as stated on the title page of your thesis, or is it Baroda, as stated in your CV on page 141? I figured this has to do with the Indian way of dealing with names. And yes, at the very moment of your birth, your birthplace was called Baroda. But somewhere along the line, this name changed to Vadodara. And this situation puts you, especially you, in an awkward position, given your position. You can't do right, you can't do wrong when you answer your birthplace. Anyhow, you first embarked on a path in civil engineering, graduating from Sardar Vallabhai Patel Institute of Technology in 2014, and you were prepared to make your mark in the world of concrete and steel. But after a couple of years in the industry, you realized your true calling lay elsewhere, not in concrete and steel, but in understanding the dynamic, complex world of soft tissues and biomaterials. And then leaving your early work as a civil and structural engineer, you transitioned to teaching in Baroda, guiding students through solid mechanics and structural theory. And then came an even bigger step. you left India to pursue a master's in biomedical engineering at Delft University of Technology, delving during your graduate project into thermoplastic-based tissue equivalents at the Malda lab at Utrecht University. And here, Shaiv, you found your passion in soft tissue biomechanics, a discovery that would shape your academic journey for years to come. And when you began your PhD journey at CARIM in 2019, you undertook an ambitious mission that would take you across borders and into diverse research communities. Your supervisory team reflects this interdisciplinary reach. Koen Racing, he's an electrical engineer. Elham is a cardiothoracic surgeon, and Wouter, a biomedical engineer, and myself, well, without a clear definition. Together, we watched you as you spearheaded projects ranging from developing an intraoperative strain measurement technique, now implemented in the workflow of cardiothoracic surgeons in Maastricht and Groningen, to creating an inverse finite element modeling algorithm for arteries, which laid the foundation for future work here at CARIM and beyond. And finally, you have a proposal for pulse wave velocity estimations that are corrected for axial elongation of arteries that you noticed during your clinical studies on aortic deformation. But of course, this journey wasn't without its fair share of hurdles. I imagine, Shaiv, you once believed, and often still do, that life as an engineer might be as straightforward as an engineer himself, structured, methodical, reliable, but yet life has proven anything but. You worked in a hospital environment, had to navigate the Spanish bureaucratic labyrinth for months to secure your contract, and even you had to adapt to an absent postdoc supervisor. They have each in their own way been learning curves. But through it all, you've stayed determined and you used your focus, precision and grit to overcome every challenge. Your work embodies a rare combination of depth and precision. Shaiv, you are undoubtedly one of the most thorough researchers I have had the pleasure to supervise. And this attention to detail sometimes took you deep into specifics. An effect we might call the black hole of research, and yet it's the same meticulousness that lends impact to your work. Today, we also recognize another mark of your dedication. Dr. Parikh, you are now part of an exclusive group. A substantial minority of my PhD candidates have, by the Defense Day, already produced a second print of their thesis. Whether it is due to layout quirks or those ever-pesky content adjustments that I leave now for now. But you have shown your commitment to excellence with every revision, and it's something we generally praise. Beyond your technical expertise, you possess a rare thoughtfulness and philosophical insight. You see science as much as an art of a discipline. You're one of those researchers who isn't content with the how of things, but also ponders on the why, and this adds layers of meaning to your work, and this can be appreciated from the various quotes preceding the chapters of your thesis. You even wanted to include philosophy into the layman talk, but then I said no. Shaiv, Laudatio also contains some advice to the new doctor, at least in my case. As your journey continues, perhaps a touch more assertiveness will serve you well. It's a quality that can be especially useful in the dynamic, sometimes turbulent environments of engineering and healthcare, but it can also be helpful in countries that exhibit social interactions and cultural behavior that you are not familiar with, such as the Netherlands with its direct approaches of people, or Spanish universities with non-transparent bureaucracy and management. Today, I would also like to congratulate you with your recently obtained Dutch citizenship. This eliminates travel barriers and symbolizes your readiness for a future on the global stage. Shaiv, today we honor not only your achievements in research, but also the solid personal foundations you've built for your life and a career in biomechanics. And because these personal foundations could not have been built without the help of family and friends, I also want to extend my congratulations to them. Dr. Parikh, we are honored to have you amidst us. Congratulations on this richly deserved achievement and all the best for your personal and scientific future. Dixie.
Dear Dr. Parikh, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. The degree committee was very impressed with your defense. The attacks came from very different angles, mathematical, biological, clinical, and you all countered them very well. But it was really important by respecting also the boundaries of your own knowledge. And that is rare, and especially the degree committee was very much impressed by that. I wish you all the best and good fortune for your future. And I'd like to thank you for being here. I'd like to thank all the opponents being here, especially the ones that came from far through the trenches of the city. And I'd like to thank all the audience and the family members also online for taking part in this ceremony today. Some household things. All the people from the aula will now go to the rector. We will make a picture on the stairs, and of course the photographer and the family members, immediate family members, can join us as well for that picture. And with that, I close this academic ceremony.